Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another fiction review. The novel we're going to look at today, it's another one of those that I bought purely because of its title. I knew nothing about the author and I don't think I even paid much attention at the time to what was written on the back. I don't think I read any of the text. I can't remember. It's that long ago. So that makes reading a book like this sort of like a blind date. That idea occurred to me when I started the first chapter. I thought, here we go. The funny thing is, I've had an awful lot of good reading experiences. It's surprising how many good experiences I've had picking books that way. The book we're looking at today is A God Strolling in the Cool of the Evening by Mario de Carvalho. Originally published in 1994, and English translation didn't come out until a few years later, 1997. It's 265 pages, and I should say that's a good solid 265. The text is about 11 point, but it is single-spaced, quite dense on the page, so you get your money's worth, if you like. And mine, of course, has been owned forever. This is my winning titles, 16 of 18 in my long TBR list, which is going to come to an end soon. This book, I don't think it ever had a Kindle copy. You can get print copies in both the UK and the US. I've seen some cheaper versions online. I found one for £3.53 that included delivery. But you'll have to listen to the rest of this review to see if it's for you. It is historical fiction. And before I talk about that, though, I've got to talk about me and my love of beat-up books. I got this copy secondhand, and I'm going to hold it up to the camera because you're going to show you that I bought it with that strip already cut in the front cover. Obviously, somebody must have been opening a box of the books when they were new, because this was in pretty good condition otherwise when I bought it. And obviously there'd been some kind of accident with a Stanley knife opening a box of books. I could have bought it at Hay on Wye, because that would be where those sort of seconds would move on to what a shop there used to be called Bookends, which would get rid of all damaged copies or unsold copies that were brought to the festival for authors to sign. That's most likely where I got it, and I most likely picked it up not long after it was translated. I would say probably 1999. And let's talk about the author. I had to do a lot of practice to get the accent on the name correctly, Mario de Carvalho. So the accent on the second syllable. He was born in 1944 in Lisbon, in Portugal, studied law at the University of Lisbon. And while he was studying at university, he became involved with a resistance movement that was working against the dictatorship of the time, which was Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. You may know him if you were around in the 70s. I have a vague memory of news articles covering that, but I was too young. In fact, I probably now need to read a history of that time, having got to know the author a bit better. He had to escape from Portugal to avoid prison, so he was in exile in France and Sweden for many years. He returned to Portugal after Salazar's death and all the political changes that were brought about by the Carnation Revolution. Again, I'm saying this like I know, but I don't know. That's another gap in my knowledge that I think is going to need to be filled in by a book. He's written 6 novels and 9 volumes of short stories. Unfortunately, apart from A God Strolling in the Cool of the Evening, none of the others have been translated into English. And his latest work, A Liberdade de Patio, The Freedom of the Yard, which is another volume of short stories, that came out in 2013. Let's talk about the setting. The setting in this novel it drove me to Google to find a map of the Roman Empire at its height, at the point that it had the greatest amount of territory. And I want to put that on screen now to continue to discuss. Our story takes place on the far western frontier of that empire in the province of Lusitania, which covered some of modern-day Portugal and some of modern-day Spain. The town of Tarcissus, where our narrator lives, it's a fictional location. And the author makes us aware of that before we even begin reading. So we don't need to wonder, well, where exactly is this town? It's somewhere inland. I get that feeling. It's not a garrison town. We also learned early on in the novel that the nearest Roman legion is several days' walking journey away. Nevertheless, the leading citizens of the town are Romans. There are Roman improvements within the walls, like an aqueduct and public baths, and Roman customs dictate how the town's government functions. Okay, now we want to know, of course, where are we in time? The Roman Empire lasted for centuries. Well, this book pinpoints it. We are within the reign of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and some of you will have read his writings, his meditations. So he ruled for 19 years between 161 and 180 AD. And it's an interesting period of time, if you think about it, because Christianity as a faith was still very tiny. It was growing, it was spreading through the Roman Empire, but it was not the accepted religion, which of course it did not become until the 2nd century AD under the reign of Constantine. The novel creates a small group of Christian citizens living in Tarcissus, and then examines the relations between different people within the town as it is under pressure from outside attack. Our book has a first-person narrator, and I'm going to read his full name. There's a real challenge to today in terms of pronunciation, isn't there? Lucius Valerius Quintius, who, as the novel opens, tells us that he was formerly something other than he is now. And what we find out then is he then backtracks after the first chapter and goes into his recent past and tells us about his time when he was appointed to be the sole governor for the town of Tarcissus. He is a man who loves to read. He very much admires Marcus Aurelius and his writings and studies the writings of other philosophers. And he tries to bring to his governance something that comes from all that reading. He aims to be a kind of philosopher, well, not king. He knows he's not a king. He understands his position in Roman government, but to try to rule according to the dictates of philosophy, to emulate his emperor. And when we meet him, it's clear that whatever happened in the near past, it's going to be disturbing in some way, and that he has not quite found closure. The chance visit from someone he knows prompts his memory to go back in time. And for the purposes of the novel, the author invents some invasion from North Africa into Lusitania at the time that Lucius is governor of the town of Tarcissus. I could not find any evidence online of this invasion. Of course, initially I got it mixed up with the later invasion of the Moors, but that was in the 800s AD and on a much larger scale. So I have to assume that this was invented to create tension, because I couldn't find an actual historical validation for any kind of incoming invaders from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula. But towns at the time were usually surrounded by a protected wall, and if they were under attack, the best thing to do would be to close up the town, bring everybody in from the countryside, and then stay there and remain under siege, trying to attack back at your attackers and repel them. And so what this creates, because most of the book is recounting this time under siege. And so there's a claustrophobic sort of pressure cooker feeling. You can imagine how townspeople are when they have to make sacrifices and be crammed close together, and they can't conduct their lives as they would normally. You can see that any disputes, any tensions within the community will grow sharper. And that is where the small group of Christians living in the town, that's where I was going to say they begin to play a role, but it's unfair to blame them for the tension. The tension comes from a general misunderstanding about them. And I suppose perhaps also a little bit of tension surrounding one particular Christian, because she is a young woman and a Roman citizen. Lucius, our governor and our narrator, he knows nothing about Christians when he takes on his post, and everything that he learns comes from just two people. Therefore, I've got to say this for anybody who's interested in early Christianity, I wouldn't say the novel is going to reveal to any reader the diversity of Christianity at this point in history, before doctrines were nailed down and people were asked by a central leadership to conform to certain beliefs. You are really not going to see that, because you have a very small group of people out on the Western fringe. So what they happen to believe is what they happen to believe, may or may not. The novel doesn't, let me back up. The novel doesn't say that this may not represent the beliefs of all Christians all over the Roman Empire, because Lucius is narrating, and basically he knows nothing. He's a blank slate, and he's taking what information he can from the tiny group of people that are close to him, the tiny group of Christians who can tell him about their beliefs. So he is able to get access to some scrolls, some scriptures on scrolls, but those are probably Septuagint Greek translations of Old Testament writings only. Okay. What the book is trying to portray, though, is how strange Christians seemed to Roman sensibilities, their cultural sensibilities, because for a Roman, the prevailing attitude was respectful accommodation of all religions and deities, and the only provisor was that you should, in return, if you were part of the empire and worshipped different gods, you should show some respect and perhaps some pious actions towards the gods of Rome and or towards the emperor of Rome as a way of showing your fealty to the empire. And of course, Christians, and I think this probably was fairly universal, would not show such fealty because it involved, from their point of view, idolatry, the worship of false gods. Let's talk about problematic content. Lucius makes one visit to Rome during his time as a magistrate of this tiny town. He and a delegation of other leading citizens from Tarcissus, they're invited by the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, to come to Rome. They're going to be rewarded for some kind of service. And as part of the hospitality that's provided for them while they're there, they're given special seats in the amphitheater at Rome to watch the gladiator games and the chariot races. And the emperor himself is in attendance at those games. Now, the lovely thing about the narration here is that the emperor can observe Lucius, and Lucius can observe the emperor. They're not sitting that close together, but they're even though there's a distance, it's not so much distance that they can't keep an eye on each other. And the emperor notices that Lucius doesn't join in with the spirit of things like the rest of his delegation. He doesn't bet on the chariot races. He doesn't start to get violent or aggressive himself in cheering on the gladiators or the animals that they are sent to fight against. Similarly, Lucius notices that the emperor pays attention for a little while and then asks to have scrolls brought to him, and he's clearly reading and doing business matters rather than paying any attention to the games. Now, the two men meet later, and they talk about their mutual distaste for brutality and their love of reason. The emperor admits to Lucius, though, in private, that he allows the games because they give the common people an outlet for their passions, which, he tells Lucius, if they didn't have this, they would probably rise up against their leaders. Now, you have to allow for the fact that the novel will describe what's going on down on the floor of that arena, and it isn't pretty. It is brutal and ugly, and it does make you think, what is it about human beings that we always like a little savagery in our entertainments? But Lucius has to take this away as a lesson, but the truth is he doesn't really apply it in his own governance of Tarcissus. And that's my rabbit hole for this review, is the novel, I would say, is examining what makes an effective ruler, really, and what do we even mean when we say effective. Lucius and Marcus Aurelius, they're both men who love knowledge and thinking and being careful about what they say and do. They read more than their contemporaries, and they try to bring the principles of reason and all the wisdom of the philosophers that they've read into their political decisions. And the reign of Marcus Aurelius was said to mark the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of the time when more and more defensive battles needed to be fought in order to keep Rome's borders where they were. Lucius is kind of like a mini Marcus Aurelius. He's trying to rule by all these principles, and he's concerned with appealing to those that he rules, but he's less concerned perhaps with manipulating them emotionally in order to ensure their continued support, even though, of course, his own emperor advised that he might want to do a little bit of that. And because he doesn't do that, even though he makes sensible decisions, and you will see this in the novel, the decisions he makes as he learns about the invaders coming toward the town, he takes measures that, yes, they're drastic, but they are aiming to save lives and property in the end, and they do. In numbers, they save a lot of lives and a lot of property. However, the citizens seem to notice that less than they ought to. And as the siege becomes less necessary, as they see the invaders move on, and then they get a Roman legion coming in to defend the town, and so it's safe to open the doors and let people come and go and do business, Lucius's popularity gradually declines, and even people who were very loyal to him, he senses that they have changed their loyalties. And so it also hints at how inevitable it is for power to change hands over time. At one point in the novel, there's a Roman senator who states matter-of-factly, Rome is eternal. And you as a reader, you roll your eyes and go, is anything eternal? And we can shake our heads, sure, but because we have a millennium of hindsight. But we can also ask, to what degree Christianity succeeded longer than Rome in holding down, okay, not a political empire as such, but a kind of influence over secular governments, because those governments, while during the Middle Ages and up until the Reformation, they had to work with the church. They got some of their power by joining themselves and cooperating with the power of the church. And I still find myself chewing on questions of power, how it gets acquired and held and lost and then captured by someone else after I finished reading this novel. And that's the review done. I'm going to do something I haven't done in a long time, but you know that feeling when you finish a book and it reminds you of other books you own that pick up similar themes. Yeah, well, that's happened in this case. I'm thinking of a work of nonfiction. It's Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, Economic Change and Military Conflict from 1500 to 2000. Right. So it was recommended by a podcaster, and I think I should stop and talk about the podcaster as well. Dan Carlin. I don't know if anyone out there was ever really into podcasts, and if they remember Dan Carlin's two shows. He did Common Sense, which was about American politics and American recent history, and then he had Hardcore History, which might cover history from around the world, but he really went on deep dives and gave you details. And so you might get a series of programs that were 2 hours long a piece, and they would cover the Persian Empire and its wars, or Rome, or the Civil War. I think he also did a long series on, and then he did one on the First World War. But my goodness, did you get a lot of information. And he recommended Paul Kennedy's book as a good way of getting a survey of how power shifted and changed over the globe during that 500 years between 1500 and 2000. And I thought, yeah, wouldn't it be cool to get that as an overall shape of things, how things shift and move? And so that's my recommendation, although I haven't done recommendations for a long time. And I also recommend Dan Carlin's podcast. He doesn't do as many these days. I think he's almost semi-retired, but his website, which I'll leave in my description box, has all his back episodes, and they're fascinating. And he is fascinating because he has that real gift that some podcasters do. Some of them, their voice and the way they put their ideas together, it's compelling listening. So I'm recommending that. I hope your reading is going well, and shout out to all those who've started their Read What You Own challenge. It's going to be great. You're going to do just fine. I say this. Let's just cheer for them, because it is a tough thing to do. And anyone who gets through it, deserves a good cheer. Right, everybody. That's it. See you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.